introduction. And thank you for everyone that's here. And if you're in Social 2000, hello, I'm Dr. Brown. So, all right, so yeah, this talk that I'm giving today is based upon an upcoming, a forthcoming book that we're working on this topic right here. James Jackson is was one of my advisors in graduate school, and we worked with I've worked with him ever since. All right, okay. So for the next, let's see, about 35 minutes, I'm going to talk about my research on the connection between race, religion, and support for policies that promote fairness, opportunities, and peace. So my interest in this topic is partially based upon my own biography. Growing up, my family attended Bethel AME Church in Arbor, AME African Methodist Episcopal Church in Ann Arbor. And this church is a middle-class black church on North Campus, on the northern end of campus at the University of Michigan. Like my parents, many of the adults in this church were Southern migrants. They were the first in their families to graduate from college, and many came of age during the civil rights or black power movement of the 1960s and 1970s. As teenagers and or young adults, some of them were involved in civil rights activities through their churches and local civil rights organizations. And so looking back, it makes sense to me that when our pastors at Bethel spoke about political issues like apartheid in South Africa, or the academic achievement gap between black and white Ann Arbor public school students, they often did so on behalf of the poor and less powerful. Now, for a number of years as an adult, I attended Central United Methodist Church, which is a progressive, interracial church with a long history of social justice activism right downtown here. And just so you can kind of get an idea of the culture of the church, here in the sanctuary you see signs of peace and justice that surround the pulpit. You have a picture of Martin Luther King, and you can't see it, but there's a quote of Martin Luther King where he talks about the injustice of racism and war. All around the church you have quotes from human rights, civil rights activists that inspire, that are very consistent with the preaching and the theology of the church. So here, as an adult, I often heard sermons about poverty in the city, the ethics of war, and trade policies that hurt workers in our nation and in foreign countries. And so, in doing that, Reverend Rowe, who was the pastor at the time when I attended, he often argued that governments have a moral responsibility to address the needs and concerns of its most vulnerable citizens. Now, outside of my personal experiences, the Moral Monday movement of North Carolina is the best contemporary example that I can think of clergy encouraging their congregants to consider and act on the ethics of poverty, racism, and social inequality. Now, Moral Mondays is led by Reverend Willie Barber. He's been featured, recently he's been featured quite a bit in the New York Times, the Washington Post. I think he has a column in the Huffington Post. And here he is, he's a pastor of Greensboro United Church of Christ in Greensboro, North Carolina. He was the president of the Greensboro chapter of the NAACP. And currently he's the director of the Moral Mondays campaign, as well as the new Poor People's campaign that he's leading. So here he is leading a demonstration in support of teachers' unions on the step of the North Carolina legislature. So the Moral Mondays movements, this movement's policy positions on issues like racial inequities in the criminal justice system, attacks on teachers' unions, and the need for funding for more social programs are largely based upon how they measure up to the standards set by Jesus' commitment to the powerless and shunned. And so for me, it's reasonable to assume that when clergy like Willie Barber of the Moral Monday movement, when they preach political sermons, what they're doing is they're trying to build support for a civil religious covenantal perspective. This perspective suggests that the U.S. is exceptional in God's sight and is the moral beacon for all other nations to follow. Because of our favorite position, they argue, this theory argued, we as a nation are required to bring about greater peace, opportunities, and fairness to everyone inside of our borders and the world over, as all are the children of God and worthy of such. So, religious leaders like Barber that adopt this perspective, they tend to believe that they are right to push the nation back on course when it strays from this commitment. So, the Moral Monday movement, others like it, along with my own personal experiences, makes me wonder about the potential of clergy around the nation to inspire such a covenantal civil religious belief among the congregants. So, in an effort to get to the bottom of this, our study assesses the degree to which hearing political sermons in worship settings differentially associates with Black, white, and Hispanic support for policies aimed at reducing racial inequality, poverty, military aggression, and increasing citizenship opportunities for immigrants. So, it's not too implausible to believe that clergy had the potential to influence political thinking because, for many, religion provides an interpretive frame that helps make sense of experiences and what is required to live an ethical life. Worship rituals like sermons often serve this function when clergy reference common stories to help congregants better understand their joys and sorrows and their obligation to others. So, for example, in inspiring compassion for immigrants, many Christian clergy often reference the Good Samaritan story, in which Jesus argues that loving God involves not only loving and showing compassion to people of their own nation or ethnic group, but for everyone. So, worshipgoers, they may buy into such interpretive frames because as Americans, we have the freedom to attend congregations of our choice or not to attend at all. This freedom, enshrined within our First Amendment, allows people to attend worship services led by clergy they agree with and trust, and with congregants they share common ideals, with whom they share common ideals. So, it's not too uncommon for worshipgoers to be friends with people they worship with. Many come to see their worship friends as part of their family, almost like part of their extended family. So, for me, as an example, I grew up Bethlehem Church. When I was there, Miss Lyons and Mr. McAfee, they also attended, and their kids attended there as well. And I saw them as my aunt and uncle. And I saw their kids as basically kind of like my cousins. And so when I graduated from college, Mr. McAfee and Miss Lyons, they were here. They attended my college graduation. When they retired from work, our families attended their retirement party. They attended my mom's retirement party. They have not yet retired. Keep talking about it, but not yet. We went on vacation with one another growing up. So basically, I mean, we love one another. Like, they're part of our family. We're part of each other's families. My relationship with Miss Lyons and Mr. McAfee, I would say, is fairly typical of the relationships that people have with people that they worship with. For many people, their church friends are an important source of support during times of loss, as well as in celebrating accomplishments. These relationships partially explain why roughly 80% of Americans trust the people they worship with. In religious institutions, despite declines in worship attendance, are among the top three institutions to which Americans have a high amount of trust. So I'm saying all this to make the point that it's not out of the realm of possibility that people would trust the political opinions of people they worship with because they like one another. They love one another. They think that the people at their place of worship have their best interest at heart, as well as the clergy. So, is this making sense to people? All right, it makes sense to me. I just want to make sure. Okay, so this is what you get, which may be a little bit surprising, but this is what you get. when clergy talk about political issues, they usually adopt this idea of this covenantal perspective. This is what they usually do. When they talk about political issues, they usually discuss issues in which they advocate against inequality. And they call for policies or practices that would reduce human suffering. So for example, what you find is that when clergy take positions on, for example, foreign policy during the sermon, when they preach about foreign policy during the sermons, they tend to be critical of military aggression as a means to reduce, as a means to handle international conflict. This is what you saw during the Vietnam War era of the 1960s and 1970s. You saw it again during the nuclear arms race era of the 1970s and 1980s, and you see it today during the war on terror era. When discussing poverty, what you usually find is that clergy that talk about poverty during their sermons, that take public positions on poverty, they tend to support a more generous welfare state. As an example, this is what you saw during the Poor People's Campaign of 1968, led by Reverend Martin Luther King. You see it today during the contemporary Poor People's Campaign, led by the Reverend Willie Barber. When discussing race, they tend to support programs aimed at reducing racial inequalities. I mean, famous example of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. You see it today during current civil rights issues, such as Black Lives Matter. Clergy that talk about it, not many don't, but those that do talk about issues like police brutality, they tend to argue that it's immoral. Just let me give you an example. Two surveys done about 47 years apart. Left here we have a survey that was conducted by the Public Religious Research Institute, national representative sample, asking people all sorts of questions. One of the questions they asked people in 2008 was if they had heard a sermon about the Iraq War at any point over the past 12 months. If the survey respondent said yes, the follow-up question was, well, what position did your clergy take? So most people said their clergy did not take a position on the Iraq War. 60% said they did not take a position on the Iraq War. But what you also see is that individuals were twice as likely to say that their clergy opposed the war during the sermon as opposed to supported the war during the sermon. 1961, a survey was conducted by, I think, researchers at the University of Michigan. This is the 1961 Negro Political Participation Study. This is a sample of Southern blacks and whites in 1961. 1961 is the year of the Freedom Rides, where you had individuals traveling on buses from northern states to the southern states to challenge racial segregation on the bus lines. So, in 1961, people are asked a bunch of questions about race. And they were asked questions about religion as well, and a host of other issues. So again, people are asked, did your clergy over the past 12 months preach a sermon about race? Racial integration specifically. If they said yes, people are asked, well, what position did your clergy take? Now in this study, a plurality of persons said no position at all on racial integration. But again, among those that you also see that people were twice as likely to say that their clergy favored integration as opposed to oppose integration. And you see this when you separate these studies by blacks and whites, you basically get the same pattern. But still, it's still important to point out that like most other areas in life, in American life, race matters. Race does matter as it relates to who supports clergy talking about political issues over the pulpit. It matters as it relates to who attends congregations in which the clergy are discussing issues like race, poverty, criminal justice, immigration, war. And it matters as it relates to the degree to which congregations are politically active and they encourage people to become politically active. I'm just giving you an example of what I'm talking about. This is Pastor William Coughlin. He was the dean at Yale College from the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s, and he was the senior pastor at Riverside Church in New York City from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s. And here he is preaching a sermon in opposition to the war in Vietnam, in which he argued that the war in Vietnam was immoral. It was inconsistent with, he's a Christian preacher, so he was arguing that it was inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus. Think about the Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus stated that blessed are the peacemakers, and blessed are those that do righteousness for righteousness' sake. He was arguing that you can't, these are inconsistent. The war in Vietnam is inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus. So what you get is that African Americans are more likely to support clergy taking very open positions on issues like war, issues like race, issues like poverty. Over and over and over again across a lot of surveys, you find the same thing. Let me just give you just 4 quick examples from the 1967, a national survey conducted in 1967, the 1989 American National Election Study, 2008 and 2016 Pew Studies. People are asked, do you support clergy discussing political issues over the pulpit? They just said political issues, just broadly, that's what the survey question stated. And what you get in these 4 surveys is basically the same thing. Blacks are more likely than whites, and Hispanics, when asked, to say yes, they support clergy talking about politics in the pulpit. And by the way, you get this when people are asked about, do you think it's okay for pastors to talk about race or poverty or foreign policy, it's the same pattern. Here's a picture of Central United Methodist Church again at a recent Martin Luther King Day service. And again, you can see a picture here. It says, Michigan says no to war. So there's a service in the church, and then people go onto Woodward Avenue with signs that talk about the need to protect teachers' unions, or to protect immigrants, or to support funding for more social programs. This is an annual event. I'm sure people have heard of it. The impetus of this event actually was the 1963 March for Freedom on Woodward, which was the precursor to the 1963 March on Washington. You guys probably already know, but just in case, King preached his famous "I Have a Dream" speech first here in Detroit. It was a rough draft, and then he preached a very similar speech in Washington, D.C. In August. So this is an event in commemoration of the 63 event. So the point here is that African Americans are more likely to attend churches like Central, where clergy encourage them to become politically active, talk about the importance of political activism, where clergy talk about issues like race, poverty, mass incarceration, war. Immigration is the exception, in which Hispanics are more likely to attend congregations in which they hear sermons about immigration. But again, these are just four examples of what I'm talking about. 4 national studies that ask respondents if in the past 12 months their clergy talked about political issues over the pulpit. And again, you basically get what I've been talking about. African Americans are more likely than whites, and 3 out of the 4 of these surveys more likely than Hispanics to say yes, they attend congregations in which their clergy talk about political issues. African Americans are also more likely to attend congregations in which the congregation is politically active. So here we find, these are surveys of clergy, and they're asking clergy if their congregations are involved in lobbying activities, protest demonstrations, voter registration activities, and community organizing. And congregations, clergy that lead predominantly black congregations are more likely than clergy that lead predominantly white congregations to do these political activities. And then 3 out of the 4, it's the same thing for Hispanics. Hispanics are as likely as Hispanic churches are as likely as black churches to involve themselves in protest demonstration activities. But in some, blacks are more comfortable with their religious leaders discussing political issues. They're more likely to hear political discussions at their place of worship, and they're more likely to attend politically active congregation. So this leads to the central question, the reason why we're here. And the central question is, to what extent are there race differences in the association between attending congregations led by clergy that discuss political issues and congregant policy attitudes? So take this quote right here from Pastor Chris Piersma from Trinity Reformed Church in Pella, Iowa, in which he states, "But the sad and chaotic events of this past summer in Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore are pretty much laying to rest the notion that racial tensions no longer exist. In fact, study after study has concluded that over the course of the last 10 years, race relations has gotten worse, not better. Most of us like to assume that we're enlightened, tolerant, and unprejudiced people. Unfortunately, a new study reveals many of us have a hidden bias against anyone with a foreign accent. Despite our cultural, ethnic, or social differences, Christians belong to the same family. One day we'll live together in perfect unity." And so the question is, to what extent would hearing a sermon like this, or that contains a passage like this, associate with how blacks, whites, and Hispanics think about racial profiling policy? To what extent would it associate with what they think should be done to reduce poverty, or issues of war? How would hearing other sermons about other topics associate with how people think about these different policy issues? That's the question. Now, there's reason to believe, it may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but there's reason to believe that hearing political sermons would more strongly associate with whites adopting progressive policy positions than is the case for blacks and Hispanics. One possible reason is that whites are more likely than blacks and Hispanics to accept the dominant narrative that opportunities for economic mobility exist for all Americans that are willing to work hard. As such, whites are less likely than blacks and Hispanics to support policies aimed at aiding racial minorities and the poor. However, whites that attend worship settings like Central are more likely to hear sermons that challenge assumptions about the openness of this nation's opportunity structure and the government's role in meeting citizens' needs. For whites, these types of politicized worship settings are unique social spaces that allow and even encourage progressive-minded persons to question what they've been led to believe about American exceptionalism and the way in which they privilege from it. Attending these types of congregations may therefore strengthen commitment to policies aimed at promoting greater peace, fairness, and opportunities for everyone, but particularly for those on the bottom. On the other hand, for blacks and Hispanics, their everyday lived experiences as members of marginalized groups may itself challenge the dominant narrative of American exceptionalism. And so, even though blacks may be more likely to hear political sermons, doing so may not challenge what they already believe about the government's obligation to provide opportunities for its citizens and to not exploit weaker nations. Equally important, Hispanics are a disproportionately immigrant population, and so their heightened optimism about economic opportunities and the political liberties within this country relative to their home nations may contribute to a strong belief in the American dream. Such hope may mute the influence of political sermons, however critical, on their public opinion. All right, so nearly all the research on this connection between race, religion, and political attitudes are based upon one study, the National Politics Study. And this study does suggest that attending congregations in which people hear political messages, it may be more meaningful to whites adopting progressive policy positions than is the case for blacks and Hispanics. But again, all the studies on this topic have been based upon one study. All the research on this topic has been based upon the National Politics Study. And so the question may arise, can we trust the findings produced from this one study? This is an important question because the National Politics Study is a little different. It's a little bit different in terms of how they collect their data. So what the National Politics Study does, their random sample is based upon where large concentration of blacks live. All right? So you have areas like Metro Detroit, places on LA, New York, large cities in the South, where large concentrations of blacks live. So you're not getting places like Idaho, Wyoming, the Dakotas. You're not sampling from those areas. Only the areas in which large concentrations of blacks live. And from these areas, they also randomly sample whites, Asians, Hispanics, and other groups that live near blacks. All right? So It's not a typical random sample in the same way that a news poll would be a random sample. They just randomly sample people. Wherever you live in the country, if you fall into the sample, you're going to get asked a question. This is the way the General Social Survey works, or the American National Election Survey works. The National Politics Study doesn't work that way. So, because this sample is so different, there are questions as to how reliable the findings are. You can trust the findings produced from the study. And so we try to get around this by looking at multiple surveys over a period of 50 years to look at the same question about race, sermons, and political attitudes. So we used a bunch of surveys over the course of 15 years to look at this question. And we start with the National Politics Study. That's where we start. And then we move on to other studies. So let me just quickly explain what I mean when I say a political sermon. This is how the National Politics Survey measures political sermon. So when you hear me say political sermon, this is what I mean. So what they do is they ask people, over the course of 12 months, have you heard a sermon in your place of worship about race, jobs, economy, or poverty, war, police, immigration? People are also asked if in the past 12 months they have been encouraged to take part in some form of political activism by their clergy, if they talked about politics in their place of worship, or if they've heard political discussions in their place of worship. So we put these questions together, come up with an index that basically measures if people attend a congregation where they hear a lot of political messages, or if they attend a congregation in which they hear fewer political messages. The policy questions are the following. We ask questions about race, foreign policy, immigration, and anti-poverty policy. That's what we're looking at. Now, what we do, we look at this connection again between attending political congregations and people's policy attitudes with the National Politics Study, and then we move on and do the same analysis on these studies. These studies work because there are similarities between these studies and the National Politics Study. So they have questions about sermons and the type of sermon that people are hearing. Questions are very similar. They ask questions about policy. They ask questions about race, foreign policy, immigration, criminal justice. But they also differ in a number of interesting ways. They're different in a number of ways. So the questions are not identical. So for example, in the National Politics Study, their race questions, and when they ask about race, they ask about racial profiling and affirmative action. In 1961, when they're asking about race, they're asking about voting rights for blacks. Do you support voting rights for blacks? In 1967, when they talk about race, they're asking about, do you think the best way to avoid another riot is by expanding civil rights for African Americans or more police presence? So they're both surveys are asking about race, but they're asking about it in different ways. Same way with foreign policy as well. 67, when they ask about foreign policy, they're talking about the Vietnam War. And National Politics Study, they're asking about Iraq and Afghanistan. They also differ in the years in which the data were collected, so the political periods are also different. The samples are different. Some of these are regional samples, like the Detroit samples, and others are national. This is a southern sample. Others are national samples. The mode is different. In some of these surveys, people have people coming up to the door and asking them to participate in the study. In others, there are telephone surveys. Some are landline. Some are cell phone. Pew surveys, they have a survey in which they have an online survey as well. So you get, the modes are different. The ways in which people are involved in the study are different. So I'll point this out to make the case that because of these differences, if we see basically the same pattern of findings across these different studies, then we have a little bit more confidence in making the case that the findings produced from the National Politics Study, they're reliable. Maybe there is something going on between attending political congregations and how people think about policy attitudes. So let's start here. I got 4 slides just to warn you. Let's start here. In this slide right here, we're looking at the probability of believing that affirmative action is a good thing by exposure to political sermons and race. And this is based upon the National Politics Study right here. These probability estimates also take into account religious faith, political partisanship, and a bunch of social demographic characteristics. So it's this idea that if people are the same across same faith, same party, same age, income, gender, region of the country, what's the connection between race? What's the connection between hearing political messages and policy attitudes by race? So what we find here is that among whites, those that go to congregations where they hear more political messages are more likely than those that go to congregations in which they hear fewer political messages to say affirmative action is a good thing. Among blacks and Hispanics, we see no relationship. There's no relationship there. Another interesting thing is that what we find among whites is that those that attend political congregations are more likely than those that don't to share the affirmative action attitudes of Hispanics. There's really no difference between this group and Hispanics. Now, we found this same pattern of relationships in other studies. In 8 other studies that we were able to find that had at least 300 whites and that had the question we were looking for, we found the same pattern of relationships. That whites that attended political congregations were more likely to support progressive race-based policies. So in 61, they were more like whites that attended political congregations were more likely to support voting rights for African Americans. In 67, whites that attended political congregations were more likely to support civil rights as a means to reduce future riots as opposed to a greater police presence. In the other studies, when we looked at African Americans and Hispanics, we found the same pattern of relationships that we found in the national politics study, which was no relationship. We did not find a connection between attending political congregations and race-based policy attitudes in other studies that we identified for African Americans and for Hispanics. In this slide right here, we're looking at the probability of opposing cuts to welfare spending by exposure to political sermons and race. Same pattern of relationships. For whites, those that attend political congregations were more likely than those that attended non-political congregations to oppose cuts to welfare spending. And again, we found no such relationship among African Americans and Hispanics. And again, whites that attend political congregations, their welfare attitudes look very similar to African Americans and Hispanics that attended political congregations. We found the same pattern of relationships among whites in 9 other studies. In 9 other studies, we found, again, the same thing. Whites that attended political congregations were more likely than whites that attended non-political congregations to support policies aimed at reducing poverty. For African Americans and Hispanics, we found a very similar pattern of relationships as we found in the national politics study, which was no connection between the two. It didn't matter if African Americans went to a political congregation or non-political congregation, both groups were equally likely to support policies aimed at reducing poverty. We did find one study that kind of bucked the trend, 2006 Faith Matters study, in that study, blacks that attended political congregations were more likely to, their relationship looked like the relationship that you saw among whites. Attending political congregations was associated with support for policies aimed at reducing poverty. In this slide, we're looking at the probability of supporting federal cuts to the Border Patrol to keep illegal immigrants out of the country. So the probability of supporting federal cuts to the Border Patrol to keep illegal immigrants out by exposure to political sermons and race. So again, whites that attended political congregations were more likely than whites that attended non-political congregations to support cuts to the Border Patrol to keep illegal immigrants out. We saw no relationship at all between with African Americans and Hispanics. And again, you find the same pattern of relationships in other studies for whites as you found in the national politics study. Same thing for Hispanics. There was no connection between attending political congregations and views about the degree to which the U.S. should provide a path to citizenship for immigrants. For African Americans, we found one study where we found no relationship at all, and one study in which we found a negative relationship, which is strange, where blacks that attended political congregations were less likely to support a policy that provided a path to citizenship for immigrants. Last one. Last data slide, a little bit more. All right, so this slide looks at the probability of opposing indefinite detention of international terrorists by political sermons and race. Whites that attended political congregations were more likely than whites that attended non-political congregations to oppose the indefinite detention of international terror suspects. We saw no such relationship among African Americans and Hispanics. And also, what's interesting here is that whites that attended these political congregations are more likely than African Americans and Hispanics to oppose the indefinite detention of international terrorists. Same pattern of relationships in other studies, where whites that attended political congregations were more likely to adopt a more of a dovish approach to foreign policy. Whereas for African Americans and Hispanics, we see no connection at all between the type of congregation you attend and your position on foreign policies, just as we observed in the national politics study. So, across surveys, this is what we get. Whites that hear political sermons are consistently more likely than other worship-going whites to maintain progressive policy positions on race, poverty, foreign policy, and immigration. We find a much less consistent relationship for blacks and Hispanics. We also find some support that white attendees of political congregations have a greater tendency to share progressive policy views with blacks and Hispanics than do white attendees of non-political congregations. So what does this all mean? Individuals that hear political sermons are likely to hear sermons that emphasize a covenantal perspective that calls the nation to create more opportunities for the poor, racial minorities, immigrants, and promote peace in the world. Hearing sermons about political issues seemingly reinforces the commitment of whites to policies aimed at achieving these goals. This may occur because there is a genuine transformation in beliefs about the roles the government should play in meeting people's needs. It is also likely that individuals that agree with these types of sermons tend to identify with the congregation's mission and remember the sermons. On the other hand, those that disagree may not recall the sermons at all, they may attend less, or they may stop attending altogether. As stated earlier, for blacks and Hispanics, the lived experiences as members of marginalized groups may itself challenge the dominant narrative that all persons and groups are treated fairly and have the same opportunity to get ahead. As a consequence, it's unlikely that hearing sermons about race, poverty, and or the need to become politically active makes blacks and Hispanics any more aware about poverty, racism, or citizenship issues. It's also unlikely to challenge what they already believe the government's role should be to provide opportunities for all of its citizens and to not exploit weaker nations. Another important development of this study is that white attendees of political congregations tend to share the progressive policy attitudes of blacks and Hispanics. But for those that think that social and global inequality is a problem, this is an important development. It's important because it speaks to the potential of faith-based groups like Moral Mondays to organize blacks, whites, and Hispanics around social justice issues of common concern. Now, although the potential exists for even more interracial community organizing through worship settings, groups like Moral Mondays face real challenges when it comes to influencing policy and keeping their base energized. One must not lose sight of the fact that in our country, public policy is largely determined by the top 3 to 5% of wealth holders in this nation. Progressive worship settings therefore face an uphill battle when challenging the dominant narrative that policies that do little to lessen racial inequality and rely upon military aggression to handle international disputes are the best way we can hope to keep our nation strong and safe. As a consequence, these religious groups are challenged in keeping their followers energized when they have little to show for themselves in the form of real policy wins. Now, for many engaged in this work, it seemingly comes down to an existential question of mission. If the mission is to push congregants to align their thinking and behavior with what they believe is God's will, then the degree to which they achieve major policy victories is beside the point. The fact that over the past 50 years, about a quarter of worshipgoers have been led by clergy that engage in justice talk suggests that a committed minority of worship spaces are working towards this goal. And the fact that hearing these sermons associates with the progressive policy positions of whites, the group that gains the most from the current social order, should provide hope for religious groups interested in improving the human condition, particularly for the least of these. All right, that is it. That's it, that's everything. Take a while. Any questions?
Comments?
Go ahead. Yep.
Interesting talk, Khari.
Yep.
Enjoy it. One question is, where are the non-worshipers? So you're just comparing political congregations with non-political congregations. So where do non-worshipers fall in terms of the comparison?
That's good. Non-worship goers for whites look very similar to whites that go to political congregations. So their beliefs about all the stuff I've been talking about are almost, there's no difference at all between them. The big difference is between those that go and don't hear any discussion at all, and those that go and hear something, or those that don't go at all. So that's what you find in study after study.
That's what I was suspecting. A quick follow-up question.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not sure if you want to go down this road or not, but
Yeah.
I assume, thinking about this, that there's specific types of churches that are non-political in certain types, not just segregated by race, but in terms of worship itself.
You're right. You're right. So, as you probably would expect, white conservative Protestant congregations, they're more conservative on these issues to begin with, altogether to begin with. On every issue I talked about and a bunch of others, they look very different from liberal mainline Protestant congregations, Catholic congregations, non-Christian congregations, and of course African American congregations. And evangelical Protestant congregations are less likely to talk about, to bring these issues up in worship settings. But what is interesting is that when you look within the denomination, so even if you look within conservative Protestant congregations that are on the news a whole bunch, clergy within these Southern Baptist congregations or these large megachurches that do decide to mention issues like race, poverty, immigration, you see the same relationship. You see the same relationship. Now, it's important to point out, here, I think a lot of things are going on. One is the news coverage, I think it fuels assumptions about what's happening, but most people don't say anything at all. Most people, first of all, most people don't talk about issues within the place of worship. And among those that do, very few take positions, so that's one thing. And evangelical Protestants are more likely to fall in the camp of not hearing anything, and when they do hear something, the pastor not taking a clear position on the issue. So that's true. But what is also true is that those few that do talk about issues, there is a connection between, but I think it's the issue of kind of theological and political culture within congregations. If you decide that you want to say something, then typically what people are saying are taking positions on issues that challenge what we've been led to believe. Most people, you don't hear clergy saying, yes, we should go to war more often. Yes, we should, have more mass incarceration. If they believe it, they don't say it. They don't mention it. It's those clergy that have a difference of opinion that speak up. And I think that's what we're observing here. I think that's what's happening here. Yes. Just real quick, let me give an example. So go ahead. No, I'll give an example. Go ahead, yes.
It's just that some churches are political, but on the right-wing spectrum.
True, you're right. Look at this survey right here. This just as an example. You have 13% of people that said their clergy supported the war in Iraq in 2008. And in 61, you had 15% of people that said that their clergy opposed immigration. So that's a good point. It's not the case that every person that speaks up about an issue is going to be on kind of the left side of the spectrum. But that's usually what you get, though. That's usually what you get. And this has been the case for a long time. This has been the case for as long as I found surveys to document it. Now again, I think that there's a disconnect between what is covered on the news versus what's actually happening. Because I think the news covers more attention to these people right here. I don't think it's equal. I haven't done the media study, but my hunch is that the coverage of these issues is different. That you get a lot of coverage of like same-sex marriage, abortion, those type of. I mean, how many people have heard of Moral Mondays? Have people heard of that? You have? Okay. Right. How many people have heard congregations take a position on same-sex marriage and abortion? Okay, right. That's my point. That's my point. And I would imagine that you looked at the activist congregations, those that are like the most active, it's probably about the same. The same amount of congregations that are speaking up about, what I mean, not speaking up, what I mean is like marching and demonstrating and, you know, making public statements in the news media. It's probably about the same. But my hunch is that the coverage is not the same. But again, what you see, well, this is what we see. This is what we see. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you so much for a really great talk.
I appreciate it.
And I'm sorry I had to be in another meeting to miss the first few minutes. And so you might have already covered this, but I'm curious in terms of your, across all of those surveys, the sample of whites, and I would assume it varies by year, but are you aware of the white population also including Jewish congregations, largely Reform, which of course tends to be much more, you know, politically open?
Good point. Good point. It really just comes down to a matter of numbers, and that's really the issue, because what you get is that I think maybe in most surveys what you find is that maybe 1 or 2% of the respondents are Jewish, identify as Jewish, which means that if you have a survey of like 1,000 people, what is that, 100 people? No, that's, what is that, 10 people? What is that? Somebody help me out. 10 people, right? 10. You can't do much with that. That's the issue. You just can't do much with that. And so when you have these large national representative samples, like we don't hardly have, we have very few Hindi, Muslims, Jews, non-Christians within these surveys. Enough that you could do like a separate analysis with.
Do the pooled analysis.
Excuse me?
You do the pooled analysis.
Yeah, well, you could do that with like, this is the issue, I mean, again, it comes down to numbers. So for example, if you looked at the American National Election Study, you could do it with that study. The problem is that they only have 1 year, 1989, where they ask about, did you hear sermons about sermons? Did you hear sermons? And in that study, they only had 800 people in that study. So there's not enough. So really what I'm talking about Christians right here. That's what I'm talking about. Because the sample, it's Christians. That's what we're talking about. Right. I mean, we're controlling for faith, but it's Christians. When I say controlling for faith, I mean controlling for the Christian denomination. That's really what I'm doing here. Yeah. Go ahead.
Excellent talk, Dr. Brown. I have a question and potentially a follow-up question. I recently read that there is apparently some kind of law or regulation in the books that prevents clergy from endorsing the political candidate. Is this true? Do you know this to be true?
Yes, that is in the IRS tax code. They cannot endorse political candidates. They cannot engage in, they spend over 10% of their time in campaigning for elected officials.
Follow-up question then.
Let me just, hold your question, because this is a good point. So, this is kind of, it's really mushy, actually, technical term. They're asking clergy, people are asked if the clergy are talking about sermons, political sermons, of course the pulpit, political sermons in the pulpit. People are saying yes or no. So, they're not actually asking clergy if they're endorsing candidates, but you kind of are. You kind of, especially if you're talking during election season, you're saying, I don't agree with drone bombing, or I don't agree with deporting all immigrants, and we should support policies and leaders that adopt this perspective. So you don't have to mention any names. People know what you're talking about, though. And actually in 2004, the don't forget your question. But in 2004, election between Bush and Kerry, there's a pastor named George Regas, who was a pastor, he's a emeritus pastor at, I can't remember the name of the church, the Presbyterian Church in Pasadena, California, in which he was preaching against the war in Iraq, and he was saying basically the same thing that Coughlin was saying, in which the war in Iraq was inconsistent with Christian ideals, and that we should support candidates that aren't encouraging war. So everybody knows he was supporting Kerry and he was opposing Bush. And the IRS did actually go after him. They eventually dropped the case. But if the IRS actually went after congregations that were talking about political issues, that would kind of hurt both parties, because both parties go to congregations during election times. So neither one of them really want to stop them doing this because it helps. Go ahead. It's like, open it up to
No, I haven't forgotten.
Go ahead, yeah.
No, is there anything to your response?
No.
So, okay, given that this regulation does exist, I've also read in the same story that there is a big pushback against it now for it to basically be reversed and allow, basically clergy free reign to say what they want about any given political candidate. Would you expect that if that were to happen, in your expert opinion, that would change this research, the nature of the data that you would be getting?
You may get a little bit more clergy that are talking about political issues. You may, but I don't think so, because there's no no clergy has actually been found guilty of engaging in political, found guilty of violating the IRS tax code over almost 60 years that it's been in existence. So I don't think it would have any impact in terms of what people are saying. You may get people a little bit more, you may get a few more that are more explicit about who they support.
Sure.
But, in my opinion, I think if you look at the data, it probably would encourage clergy that are on the more progressive side to keep talking even more. They're the ones that are speaking out the most. So I know, like Trump was saying he wants to get rid of the Johnson Amendment, but actually I think that would be, if you're Republican, a bad idea. Because then you get more of these people talking. You get more people like Central United Methodists walking up and down the street. If you're Republican, why would you want that? The Democrats, at least progressive Democrats, if I was advising them, I would say, kind of support encourage Trump to keep going with that.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, well, appreciate it, people. Thank you.